Symbiosis, by Stephen Lake. Robert Duller, an ace reporter for the Chicago Tribune, strolled into a dark, smoky bar in the Upper West Side of New York, and studied the area around him. Present in the room was your typical selection of the shady, and the mysterious, all there to do business of the less than honorable, and in some cases, legal kind. As his eyes pierced the darkness looking for a story, he spotted an older man in a tan trench coat sitting in a corner booth nursing a glass of brandy. He quickly slipped across the room and settled into the booth across from him. The old man ignored him for several moments, as though hoping he'd go away. But Robert persisted, saying nothing audibly to the man, even though his eyes spoke volumes. Finally, unable to bear the gaze of the reporter any longer, the man glanced up at him with a look of muted displeasure in his eyes. "May I help you?" he answered with displeasure. Robert smiled slyly. "You're Merlin, correct?" he asked. The man cocked an eyebrow. "I am." "And you are Robert Duller, ace reporter for the Chicago Tribune, here to do an article on me. Am I correct?" he said. Robert nodded. "You are. Sir, it took forever to track you down, so I'm hoping you'll indulge me for a few moments." The man took a sip of his drink, and then set it down. "What is it specifically that you want to know?" he asked. Robert smiled. "Everything about you that you're willing to tell me." Merlin raised an eyebrow in intrigued interest. "Everything? That's a tall request. Are you sure you can handle what I'm about to say?" Robert smirked. "I've seen things that would make most people lose their mind. I doubt you can throw anything at me that would be any worse than I've already seen." Merlin grinned slyly. "We shall see," he said with muted, dark glee. He took another sip of his drink, and then nodded towards the bartender. "Arthur and I belong to the Symbiosis," he said. "Arthur?" asked Robert. "The bartender. He's one just like myself, a symbiont." Robert shook his head. "You've lost me. What is the Symbiosis, and what do you mean by saying you're a symbiont?" Merlin sighed. "I guess I must take you back to our origins for you to understand who, and what we are. In the plainest sense of the word, and by your limited, almost malign misunderstanding, we are what you would call living cancers." Robert scratched his head in confusion. "All right, now you've really lost me." Merlin grinned malevolently. "As I said, the truth is likely more than you can bear." Robert waved dismissively. "No, no. Please continue. At some point this will all make sense to me. So I'll just struggle along for now, and eventually I'll catch on. So why don't you start by telling me when you were born? That's always a good place to start." Merlin nodded. "I was born on May 5, 1975 in the pancreas of a middle-aged man, an accountant by trade, who lived in southern Michigan. My existence was spawned by another of my kind who laid the seeds of my creation within my host, unbeknownst to him. For nearly 2 years I festered, growing stronger in the man's body as any cancer would do. That is, until I was detected. As I looked on through his eyes, I could feel the fear growing in him as he was lied to by an evil, wicked doctor. And, because of him, instead of embracing me as a part of himself, as a fellow life form in search of the same things as he was, he instead chose to fight me, to kill me without even knowing who I was, or why I was there." Merlin paused briefly, and then sighed angrily. 2 weeks later he went to surgery to have me removed. They put him under anesthesia and viciously cut me from his body," he continued acrimoniously. He paused again, collected himself, and then continued. "After I was removed, I was thrown into a box, carved into little pieces, studied, analyzed, poked and prodded. I was a freak show attraction for the doctors to study as they searched for better ways to kill myself, and those of my kind. Eventually, I was dumped into a bag of biological waste to be incinerated. However, fate had other plans for me. Consigned to my doom, I was surprised to find another, a symbiont like myself, working at the hospital. He bravely rescued I, and another symbiont, from certain death. He put us in a bag, and carried us home with him. But, when we arrived, we discovered that it was not out of sympathy that he had saved us. he had darker, more sinister plans for our bodies. We knew at that moment that we had to flee for our lives. Finding an opportunity to escape, we slipped away from him, and hid ourselves within a bag of garbage. For 2 days and nights we slept in there quietly, trying our best not to let our presences be known. Eventually the bag was taken out and disposed of. "They took you to the garbage dump, didn't they?" asked Robert. Merlin shook his head. "Not immediately. We were tossed out onto the street where we were left to suffer for an entire day in the sweltering heat, and then an entire night that was dark and icy cold. Eventually the garbage truck came and took us away. By now, any normal creature would have died, or given up hope of ever surviving another day. But we were of the Symbiosis, and refused to go quietly into the night. And that will to survive benefited us. A short while after we arrived at the dump, we were greeted by other of the Symbiosis, those who had arrived there before us. They took us home, fed us, gave us a place to stay, and taught us everything we know. During that time we grew, and matured, and slowly changed from hideous, gruesome creatures, into the well-formed bodies you see before you." Robert scribbled frantically on his notepad, unsure how this would all make sense, or where this would end up. But what the old man was telling him was fascinating, if not somewhat unbelievable. Either way, it would make an amazing centerpiece for the Saturday edition. "So how old are you?" he asked. Merlin grinned. "Would you believe that I'm only 30, he replied. 30? You look well over 60, said Robert in surprise. "That is because I was seeded in an older man, and thus I am born from older cells. Hence why I have aged so much faster than one of your own would." "So what happened after your training?" asked Robert. "I was eventually brought into the Symbiosis, a society of creatures like myself, cancers who have survived their childhood, and grown up to be adults. They groomed us for this day, a day when we would be required to step out into your world, and both live among you, and also continue our genetic heritage by seeding ourselves among your people in much the same way we were seeded. It is how we breed, if you will, and perpetuate our species. So what's the purpose of the Symbiosis? Are you just here to infect everyone in the world, as you've said, with the seeds of your own kind?" Merlin cocked an eyebrow slightly. "The purpose of the Symbiosis is much deeper, and far grander, than that. It is our mission to seek out others of our kind, and protect them from all harm and death, even if it means the destruction of their hosts." "So there's a whole society of people like yourself?" asked Robert in interest. Merlin nodded. "There is. Many tens of thousands of us." "So what kind of species are you? Are you from outer space, or are you the creation of some mad scientist from somewhere in this world?" Merlin cocked an eyebrow slightly. "We are human just as you are, although of a different line of descent. Just because we are grown from cells you would call cancerous does not make us any different than you. We live, we love, we grow old, and we die. Assuming what you say is true, how can you justify killing people in order to reproduce?" barked Robert. Merlin glared at the reporter through narrow, slotted eyes. "We do what we must in order to survive." "It's no different than what you would do," he replied with a hint of anger in his voice. "No different. You willingly infect humans with your young, and then use our bodies as your personal buffet, consuming us slowly over time until there is nothing left. How is that anything close to being human?" said Robert as he glared at Merlin. "I admit that such should not be, nor was it so in times past. At one time we were allies, symbionts and humans joined together in a common cause, with us seeding ourselves into willing hosts who carried our young, and gave of themselves freely to ensure the perpetuation of our species." "And your ancestors killed them too, right?" snapped Robert. Merlin shook his head. "In return for what they gave us, we offered them many gifts that they could not acquire themselves. Things such as superhuman strength, perpetual health, and unnaturally long life. It is not our will that we harm your people. Just as in times past, we desire to live in harmony with you. But since you will not permit us to, we are forced to do all that we can to survive, even if that means killing some of your kind in order to live and survive. You would not expect any less of your people should you be threatened with extinction." Well, why don't you infect animals, instead of us? Merlin cocked his head. Because, we are kinsmen to you, not animals. We cannot survive in any other creature. It is true that there are others of our kind who are born of, and inhabit the bodies of animals. But we view them merely as distant cousins, and not our brethren like yourself. Just then, Merlin sensed something. He stretched out his arm toward Robert, closed his eyes, and waved his hand back and forth slowly in front of the reporter's chest, as though searching for something. Robert saw this and recoiled slightly, as though a touch from Merlin's hand would bring instant death to him. After a moment, Merlin opened his eyes and smiled knowingly. How fascinating. You have a young one in you. He resides in your liver, to be exact, he said in pleased surprise. Robert blinked in surprise. How did you know that? Nobody but my doctor and I know that I have liver cancer. Merlin smiled kindly. I can feel him. He is still an infant, and is not aware of what he is doing. But, in a few months, he will grow wise enough to know what he is, and what he is doing to you. After a moment, Merlin's smile faded. You are not intending on killing him, are you? He asked angrily. Robert nodded. I begin cancer treatments on Monday, he replied. Merlin leaned over the table and stared deeply at Robert, causing the reporter to withdraw in fear and uncertainty. Come with me to the Symbiosis. Allow us to commune with this young one and save it from certain doom. And, if you willingly offer your body to us, we will give you abilities beyond your wildest dreams. Robert jumped up and backed away from the table. You're a freak, I tell you. A freak? I'm leaving. And, if you really are a living cancer, I hope that someone kills you. I hope someone finds a way to kill all of you, he screamed. Just then two men grabbed him by the arms and held him fast. Arthur stepped out from behind the bar and up to Robert as the reporter struggled fruitlessly to free himself. He studied Robert briefly, and then glanced at Merlin, who nodded. Take him to the gestation chambers. Make sure that he is well fed and looked after. We have a young one who is growing inside of him. I would hate to see it killed before it has come to maturity, he said with dark glee. No, cried Robert as he again tried to free himself. But, despite his best efforts, he could not break loose. As Robert was being dragged away through the back door of the bar, Merlin sat quietly at his table and sipped his drink. I shall enjoy the birth of this young one. We have not had a liver symbiont in quite some time, he said with dark glee. He then raised his glass to his lips as he began to laugh demoniacally. The end.